Benefits of doing springs, retainers, head studs for the EA839. Well, there's two things. So the head studs give more clamping force on the cylinder head to keep the head gaskets from leaking. The factory head studs, head bolts, when you turn up the boost, do start to stretch. So every time you have a combustion event, it's almost like a stick of dynamite going off inside the combustion chamber. You know, in a space about this big, a space that would fit in the palm of your hand. A massive explosion, and so that creates a ton of pressure that pushes up on the cylinder head. And stock head bolts are fine for factory power. They're even okay for like probably stage one type stuff. But once you really start turning up the power, the size of and pressure of the explosions essentially doubles over stock, and that puts a lot more force on the factory head bolts, which, if they even stretch just a 10,000th of an inch, or some very small amounts, the amount of clamping force is reduced. As the clamping force reduces over time with the stretching, the pressure is no longer contained in the combustion chamber, and combustion pressure will leak from the combustion chamber into the water jacket of your cooling system. And so what happens is you start smelling coolant, you start losing coolant, and you don't really know why. And the reason is because the head gasket is no longer being clamped with the right amount of force. So the head studs that we sell are made from a steel with a much higher tensile strength, essentially double of what the factory head bolt is. And so these head studs made with a much higher tensile strength chromoly material can withstand the forces of combustion. They don't stretch. They keep the maximum amount of clamping force down on the head gasket. This is a solution typically that we recommend for anyone who's running stage 3 tunes, especially the high output files. You don't necessarily need to run out and do this, but once you start having the coolant consumption issue, then you know it's time to do it. Thankfully, it's not a catastrophic failure. You can keep driving the car, but you're going to have to stay off the power until you get that done. Valve springs and retainers allow the engine to rev higher, and so there's a problem with all valve springs and retainers, that at some point the spring isn't stiff enough, and or the retainer is too heavy, and so it essentially creates this, that toy, the paddle with the ball and the rubber band on it. And so, what you normally want is the paddle and the ball to be touching each other. But if you start going fast enough, the ball comes off the paddle and starts bouncing. And that's what happens when you get valve float, is the camshaft is actually slapping the spring down off its seat, and the spring the spring and valve stay open longer than they should be, because they're not touching the camshaft lobe anymore. So it'd be the difference between kind of like, bouncing a ball and slapping a ball. So by reducing the mass of the retainer, which reduces the amount of inertia in that assembly, and increasing the spring force, it allows the valve and retainer assembly to continue to function at higher RPMs. So that's what springs and retainers do. We recommend that also for anyone who's consistently revving their engine higher. When you get valve float, you start losing power, because instead of air flowing in and out of the combustion chamber or pressure being held in it, it's just staying open too long.
Yeah, it manifests itself in very fun and interesting ways. You can either be misfires, it can just be a massive nosedive in power on the top end.
You see this pretty much in all Audi motors. We initially really started seeing it in the 24 valve VR6, but all these motors with the rocker arms do float. Usually in the 7,000 to 8,000 RPM range.
And it depends on boost too. Boost plays a huge factor in it.
Well, boost aggravates it, right? So you have pressure in the
pressure
port
on the seat,
pushing down on the valve. So you need to offset that pressure with a stiffer spring. The spring's the only thing that's pulling the valve shut. So yeah, this is aggravated. A lot of times when I've seen it, when I've been tuning over the years, it's like the engine just go like the engine feels like it's revving into mud.
Yeah.
You know, it's just kind of it just loses power, even though it's still revving. You just see the power drop on the dyno.
All your data starts looking weird. And, the motor starts being much less of a motor and more just a passive blob of metal.
So what do we see for the 3.0 T motors? Do we have a special tune for that or?
I'm sorry, I was zoned out for a lot of that. For valve springs, or are you talking?
Oh, we don't have a tune for valves. We don't have a valve spring tune.
No, not specifically. Not anything that would, because it's one of those, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was telling someone.
It's one of those, supporting mods, but we don't have a specific, tuned path for that. It's a nice to have at this point to ensure you're in good shape with it. So. But no, there's no one of the reasons for float you can get into is the turbo. The turbine side is getting restrictive enough at the top end that your map EMAP is getting high enough that it is basically holding that valve open. It's having a hard time pushing against the spring itself.
Which is exhausting.
Which is, you don't want to just keep, upping the spring pressure just to cram, a higher and higher level of, exhaust manifold pressure through there. There's a very quick diminishing return there.